So Stephen Covey talks about habits of independence and then habits of interdependence. And while you're not going to fully just work and focus on independence before you can really interact with others and think about those habits of interdependence, until we've mastered the private victories, we're not going to be able to master fully the public victories or working completely interdependently, completely effectively. So we're going to focus on habits 1 through 3 first, which deals with the private victories or those habits of independence. So here are these independent habits. Habit 1 is be proactive. Habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. And habit 3 is put first things first. And this video is going to focus on habit number 1, be proactive. So as part of the educational team, think about how much stimuli is coming at each and every one of us constantly every single day. We've got student needs, sometimes multiple student needs, and student behaviors, and the students' engagement with the lesson. Are they getting it, or do we need to backtrack a little bit and review previous material, or slow down and reframe the lesson in a different way? And we've got coworker interactions within and outside of the classroom on a daily basis. School announcements, parent emails, and calls. I think one of the hardest things about our jobs is that we have so much coming at us constantly that it's really hard to figure out how we avoid just being in a reactive mindset. If we're just reacting to constant stimuli and not really thinking about the big picture and what we're trying to accomplish on a day-to-day basis, it feels like we're just getting lost and we have no control over our lives or the direction that we're heading. And I find it really challenging when there's already so much material to cover, so little time. And special education, there's always this pressure and always this drive to close the gap between where our students are and where their typically sighted peers are or typically developed peers are. And it's really, I need to continuously remind myself to take a step back, look at the big picture, think about what can I do to make this the most productive day and effective day for my students. So I keep seeing studies that are coming out that say that teachers make more minute-by-minute decisions than brain surgeons. So the level of mental demand on all of us as a team, as team players, is just huge, and it's something to be mindful of. Just, first of all, giving ourselves forgiveness with the level of mental and maybe emotional too, exhaustion at the end of the day, but also thinking about how we can lessen the demand on ourselves in small ways throughout the day to make our jobs more sustainable. So I'm defining stimulus as something that triggers energy or activity. It triggers a response for us. So those examples before of student behaviors, of student needs that are coming up, I'm using those as stimuli. And we cannot always just choose one stimulus that's coming at us. Sometimes there are multiple stimuli. I really like this visual because especially when there's a lot of stimuli coming at me, I like to remind myself that there's actually a gap between what's coming at me, these external forces, and my response. So that means if there's a gap between the stimulus and response, I have the freedom to choose what goes in that gap. I can even take a moment, pause, think about my reaction, and even extend that gap a little bit before I choose what my response will be. This is really important for our students too. Even the students who are Braille readers, I've embossed this and made it tactile for them, and I think it's helped them to have something tangible that they can hold on to remind themselves that they actually have freedom between the external things that they can't control and what they could choose the response to be. And it's a continuous work in progress for all of us. I know days where I am really tired or days that are harder and I feel like more stimuli is coming at me than I'm capable of handling. My responses are not always going to be perfect, but keep coming back to this as a way and as a tool that I can use to remind myself there's actually so much freedom and so many choices that I have autonomy to make over the course of my day. And if I'm demonstrating that I have that freedom and that's part of my own mindset, I can so much better teach my students to be mindful of their reactions. And that freedom is the wonderful part of being human. It's what separates humans from other animals. Because in that freedom to choose, we have self-awareness, imagination, our conscience, and our independent will. So that's a huge amount of power that we have. So I love how Stephen Covey breaks down the word responsibility into response ability. Oftentimes responsibility is thrown around with our students, but breaking it like this, like we have the ability to choose our responses, I think is huge for our students. And as humans, we're able to choose our response to stimuli. So he kind of takes that Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility, and he flips it. With great responsibility comes great power. The more that we are able and we practice our ability to choose our responses, the more power over our own lives and the more positive influence we can have over our situation. So this brings us to our first habit, be proactive. But what does be proactive actually mean? This is another word that gets thrown around a lot without a lot of discussion about about the meaning behind it. So we have Stephen Covey's circles. In the middle, we have the circle of control. So it's the smallest, but it's in the center. This is everything that we can directly control. In the middle, we've got our circle of influence. So things we can't directly control, but we have influence over. So we have the ability to directly control our attitude and how we come in each morning and each day. And that might expand to our circle of influence, how others react to us. And then we've got circle of concern. The circle of concern is always going to be the biggest, and it should always be the biggest. Otherwise, we're going to be living very self-centered lives. The circle of concern for our students, for our families, for politics, for everything that's happening in the world is going to be bigger than what we can actually control. And it's not that we shouldn't have that circle of concern. We just need to spend the majority of our time focusing on the circle of control and the circle of influence in order to make the biggest impact that we can. This is something else I've embossed and I've made copies of for my students, and it seems to really, really be helpful for some of them, particularly those who have a challenging time controlling their emotions or controlling their responses to their emotions. I've got a student who will now actively say when she's upset, oh, can we do circles? Can we do our circles? And I can journal about what's in my circle of control and what's outside of my circle of control. So this language may or may not be appropriate for specific students. If it works for students, great. I think it's a valuable tool. But even students where the language is not appropriate for them, I think we can still frame questions and frame conversations with them that uses this principle. So how do these circles relate to being proactive? Well, we have a proactive focus here where we're focusing on our circle of control and circle of influence and how we can expand that. Or we have a reactive focus where we're primarily in our circle of concern, which is really shrinking our circle of influence because we're not taking action. So let me think of an example of how this relates to our lives as educators. In my circle of concern, or my students' well-being and home life, I cannot control what their experience is at home. I can control how I respond to that student in the classroom, how I reach out to parents and offer them support, what materials I send home to support parents, the positive discussions or the positivity that I can bring to parent discussions. All of these things are within my circle of control and perhaps even circle of influence. And the more I focus on what I can control, what is within my direct power, and where I might be able to insert some of my influence in a positive way, the more impact I'm able to make. Obviously, we want to have more of a proactive focus where we are primarily focusing on the circle of concern and our circle of influence. It doesn't mean that our circle of concern isn't always going to be bigger, but what we focus on becomes larger. So if we're focusing primarily in those circles of control and circles of influences, those are going to expand over time. So this is habit number 1. I hope that you will stay with me for habits number 2 and 3 and beyond. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you soon.